I want to talk to you about something that's been making the rounds lately. The idea that Social Security could rise by up to $5,000 under a key change to how cost of living adjustments are calculated. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. You've heard these headlines before. Big promises, complicated policy, and then nothing changes. So let me be clear right from the start. This isn't about a guaranteed windfall coming your way next month or even next year. This is about understanding a real policy proposal that has real potential, but also real obstacles. And I'm going to walk you through all of it, plainly and honestly, so you can decide for yourself what it means and whether it's worth your attention. If you're living on Social Security right now, you already know the frustration I'm talking about. The annual cost of living adjustment comes through, maybe 2 or 3%, and it sounds okay on paper. But then you go to the pharmacy, and your medication costs more. Your homeowner's insurance went up again. The electric bill is higher. The groceries that used to cost $60 now cost $85. And you realize that your COLA didn't actually keep up with your real expenses. It covered some of it, sure, but not enough. You're still falling behind, just a little slower than you would have without it. That's not a coincidence. And it's not just bad luck. It's because the formula the Social Security Administration uses to calculate your annual increase wasn't designed with retirees in mind. It was designed to track the spending habits of working people. And working people spend their money differently than retirees do. That's the heart of this entire conversation. So when you hear that Social Security could rise by up to $5,000 under a key change, what they're talking about is switching the formula. Instead of using something called the CPIW, which stands for the Consumer Price Index for urban wage earners and clerical workers, the proposal is to use the CPI, which stands for the Consumer Price Index for the elderly. And over the course of 10 or 15 or 20 years, that switch could mean that someone's monthly benefit ends up being a few $100s higher than it would have been under the old formula. Add that up over time, and yes, the cumulative difference could reach several $1,000s. Maybe even $5,000 or more for someone who lives long enough. But here's what that number doesn't mean. It doesn't mean you're getting a check for $5,000. It doesn't mean your monthly benefit jumps by $5,000 next year. It means that if this change were adopted today, and you collected benefits for another 15 or 20 years, the total amount you would receive over all those years combined would be several $1,000s more than under the current system. It's real money. It's meaningful, but it's gradual, and it's cumulative. And it only happens if the policy actually gets passed, which so far it hasn't. So let's slow down and talk about what's really going on here. Every year, the Social Security Administration adjusts benefits to account for inflation. That adjustment is called the Cost of Living Adjustment, or COLA. The purpose is simple: to make sure your purchasing power doesn't erode as prices go up. If milk costs more this year than it did last year, your benefit should go up enough to cover that difference. That's the idea, anyway. To calculate the COLA, the SSA relies on data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Specifically, they use the CPIW, which tracks the prices of goods and services that urban wage earners and clerical workers buy. Every quarter, the BLS surveys what people in this category are spending money on: food, housing, transportation, medical care, entertainment, and so on. Then they measure how much those prices have changed compared to the previous year. The SSA takes the average of the third quarter measurements from one year to the next, and that percentage becomes your COLA. Now here's the issue. Urban wage earners and clerical workers are mostly younger people who are still working. They're not retirees, and their spending patterns are different. They spend a smaller percentage of their income on healthcare because they're generally healthier. They spend more on transportation because they're commuting to work. They might spend more on education or childcare. Retirees, on the other hand, spend a much larger share of their income on healthcare, prescription drugs, and housing costs like property taxes and insurance. And those costs have been rising faster than the overall inflation rate for years. That's where the CPI comes in. The Bureau of Labor Statistics developed this index specifically to track the spending patterns of people aged 62 and older. It measures the same kinds of goods and services as the CPIW, but it weights them differently to reflect what seniors actually buy. Healthcare gets a bigger weight. Prescription drugs get a bigger weight. And when you run the numbers, the CPI almost always shows a higher rate of inflation than the CPIW. Not by a huge amount, We're talking about a difference of maybe zero point 0.2 or zero point 0.3 percentage points per year on average. Some years it's more, some years it's less, and occasionally the CPIW is actually higher. But over time, that small difference compounds. If your COLA is 2.5% under the CPIW, but would have been 2.8% under the CPI, that's an extra 0.3% that year. The next year, you're getting your COLA on a slightly higher base amount. Then the next year, and the next year. Over a decade or two, that compounding adds up to hundreds of dollars a month in additional benefits, which is where that $5,000 figure starts to come from. Let me give you an example with some rough numbers. Let's say you're receiving $1,800 a month in Social Security. Under the CPIW, your benefit might grow to about $2,300 a month over the next 15 years, adjusting for inflation every year at an average rate. Under the CPI, with that slightly higher inflation adjustment every year, your benefit might grow to about $2,500 a month over the same period. That's a $200 a month difference. Multiply that by 12 months, and it's $2,400 a year. Over just a few years, that adds up to several $1,000s in cumulative additional income. That's real money. And for someone living on a fixed income, it could make a meaningful difference in quality of life. So why hasn't this been done already? If the CPI is more accurate for retirees, and if it would help people keep up with their actual expenses, why are we still using the CPIW? The answer is complicated, and it comes down to politics and money. First, there's the cost. Social Security is already facing long-term funding challenges. The trust fund is projected to be depleted sometime in the next decade unless Congress makes changes. Switching to the CPI would increase the total amount of benefits paid out every year, which would speed up that depletion. Estimates vary, but some analyses suggest it could cost tens of billions of dollars over 10 years. That's not an insurmountable amount in the context of the federal budget, but it's not nothing either, and it would require either raising additional revenue or cutting costs elsewhere. Second, there's political will. Any change to Social Security requires legislation, and legislation requires consensus. There are members of Congress who support switching to the CPI. Some have introduced bills specifically for this purpose. But there are also members who oppose it, either because they're concerned about the cost or because they favor other approaches to Social Security reform. And in a divided Congress, getting 60 votes in the Senate and a majority in the House is difficult, especially for something that increases spending without a clear funding mechanism. Third, there's the broader debate about how to fix Social Security's funding gap. Some lawmakers argue that if we're going to spend more money on benefits, we should prioritize the people who need it most, like low-income beneficiaries or very old retirees, rather than giving a small across-the-board increase to everyone. Others argue that we should focus on shoring up the trust fund first before we expand benefits at all. And still others believe that the CPI, while better than the CPIW, still isn't perfect and that we should be looking at even more accurate measures of senior cost of living changes. Now, it's worth noting that advocacy groups for seniors and retirees have been pushing for the CPI for years. Organizations like AARP, the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare, and others argue that this isn't about giving retirees a bonus. It's about accuracy. It's about making sure that the cost of living adjustment actually reflects the cost of living for the people receiving it. They point out that Social Security is supposed to provide economic security, and if the COLA doesn't keep up with real expenses, then the program is falling short of its mission. That's a fair point, and it's one that resonates with a lot of people. At the same time, fiscal watchdog groups and some policymakers caution that expanding benefits without addressing the funding shortfall could make the long-term problem worse. They're not necessarily opposed to the CPI, but they want to see it paired with revenue increases or other reforms that ensure the program remains solvent for future generations. So where does that leave us? The CPI is one option among several being discussed. It's not the only way to improve Social Security, and depending on your priorities, it might not even be the best way. For example, some proposals focus on raising or eliminating the payroll tax cap. Right now, Social Security taxes only apply to the first $168,600 of earnings. Anything you earn above that isn't taxed for Social Security purposes. If that cap were raised or eliminated, high earners would pay more into the system, and that additional revenue could be used to shore up the trust fund, increase benefits, or both. That's a different kind of reform, and it has its own political challenges, but it's one that some people argue is more sustainable in the long run. Another option that gets discussed is means testing benefits, so that higher income retirees receive less and lower income retirees receive more. Or adjusting the formula to provide a higher minimum benefit for people who worked low-wage jobs their whole lives. Or changing the full retirement age again, or some combination of all these things. The point is, the CPI is part of a much larger conversation about how we want Social Security to work and who we want it to serve. What I want you to take away from all of this is that the CPI is a real proposal with real merit, but it's not a done deal, and it's not a miracle solution. It would help. It would make the COLA more accurate for retirees. It would put more money in people's pockets over time, but it would also cost money, and it would require political action, and it would need to be balanced against other priorities. If you think this is something that matters, the best thing you can do is stay informed. Understand what the CPI is, how it works, and what it would mean for your benefits. When you hear politicians or advocacy groups talking about Social Security reform, pay attention to the details. Are they proposing the CPI? Are they proposing something else? How do they plan to pay for it? What are the trade-offs? And if it's important to you, let your representatives know. Not in an angry or demanding way, but in a clear and respectful way. Tell them that you depend on Social Security, that you've noticed your COLA doesn't keep up with your real expenses, and that you support using a more accurate measure of inflation for retirees. You can call their offices, send a letter, or use their online contact forms. It doesn't take long, and it does make a difference, especially when they hear from a lot of people saying the same thing. The $5,000 figure you might have seen in a headline is a way of illustrating the long-term impact of a seemingly small change. It's not a promise, and it's not happening tomorrow. But the underlying idea, that Social Security's cost of living adjustment should reflect the actual cost of living for the people receiving it, is both reasonable and overdue. Whether it happens depends on all of us. Staying engaged, asking the right questions, and making sure the people who represent us know what we need.